Part 2 of the friendship. The months after Jacob's agreement passed in a haze of doctor's visits, awkward conversations, and fleeting moments of hope. Claire finally became pregnant after several rounds of insemination, and for a while it felt like things were falling into place. Matt and Claire were ecstatic, and Jacob tried his best to share in their joy, despite the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. But as Claire's pregnancy progressed, so did the subtle cracks in their relationship. Jacob found himself visiting more often, doting on Claire in a way that felt both natural and deeply uncomfortable. He hadn't realized how attached he had become to the baby, his baby, growing inside of her. He began to see her in a different light, noticing the small details he had overlooked before, the way her face glowed when she laughed, the softness in her eyes when she talked about the future. At first, Jacob tried to ignore these feelings, brushing them aside as mere gratitude for the opportunity to help his friends. But the more time he spent with Claire, the more those feelings grew, taking root in his mind like a creeping vine he couldn't cut down. Matt, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the subtle shift in the dynamic between his best friend and his wife. He was focused on preparing for fatherhood, throwing himself into the logistics of baby-proofing their home, setting up a nursery, and making sure everything was perfect for the arrival of their child. But something was beginning to simmer beneath the surface, something dangerous and unspoken. It was a rainy evening when the first real crack in their relationship appeared. Jacob had come over to help Claire with some errands while Matt was out of town on a work trip. She was 6 months pregnant, her belly round and prominent, and Jacob couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride every time he saw her. He had watched her body change, knowing that his child was growing inside her, and that knowledge sparked emotions he hadn't anticipated. They were sitting on the couch, sharing a quiet moment after dinner, when Claire turned to him, her eyes soft and full of something Jacob couldn't quite place. "I'm scared, Jake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so scared about what's going to happen when the baby comes. What if Matt and I aren't ready? What if we can't do this?" Jacob felt a pang of sympathy for her, and without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. "You're going to be an amazing mother," he said softly. "And Matt, well, he's going to be a great dad. You guys are going to be fine." Claire looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What about you? What are you going to be to this baby?" The question caught Jacob off guard. He had never really thought about it. He had agreed to be the biological father, but they had never discussed what role he would play once the baby was born. He had assumed he would remain in the background, a supportive figure, but not much more. Yet now, looking at Claire, he realized that wasn't enough. He couldn't simply stand by and watch from the sidelines. I don't know," Jacob admitted, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, they sat there in silence, their hands still intertwined. And then, something shifted. Claire leaned in, her breath warm against his skin, and before Jacob could stop himself, he leaned in too. Their lips met, softly at first, then more urgently, as though they had both been waiting for this moment for far too long. It was a kiss filled with longing, with unspoken desires that had been bubbling beneath the surface for months. But as quickly as it started, it ended. Claire pulled away, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob's heart raced. He knew she was right. This was wrong, so wrong, but in that moment all he could think about was how much he wanted her, how much he had wanted her for months. "We shouldn't," Claire repeated, but her words lacked conviction. "I'm sorry," Jacob said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." But before he could finish, Claire stood up abruptly, her face flushed with emotion. "You need to go, Jake. Please, Matt can't know about this." Jacob nodded, his stomach churning with guilt. He stood and left without another word, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him like a crushing force. After that night, things were never the same. Claire avoided Jacob as much as possible, and when they did see each other, the air between them was thick with tension. Matt, oblivious to the growing storm, continued preparing for fatherhood, his excitement blinding him to the subtle shifts in his wife and best friend. Jacob, meanwhile, was consumed with guilt. The kiss haunted him, but so did the realization that his feelings for Claire were much deeper than he had thought. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying the moment over and over again, wondering what might have happened if they hadn't stopped. Weeks passed, and the baby's due date grew closer. The tension between Jacob and Claire became unbearable, and despite their best efforts to hide it, Matt began to notice the distance between them. He asked Claire about it one evening, but she brushed it off, blaming her pregnancy hormones and the stress of preparing for the baby. But Matt wasn't satisfied with that answer. He began watching them more closely, paying attention to the way Jacob's eyes lingered on Claire when he thought no one was looking, or the way Claire seemed to tense up whenever Jacob was around. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow, festering inside Matt like a slow poison. It was 2 weeks before the baby was due when everything finally came crashing down. Matt had been restless for days, his suspicions gnawing at him. One night, after Jacob had left their house following a tense, silent dinner, Matt confronted Claire. "What's going on between you and Jacob?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. Claire froze, her eyes wide with panic. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm not stupid, Claire. Something's changed between you two. I see the way you look at him, the way he looks at you." Claire's face paled. "Matt, please, it's not what you think." "What I think?" Matt's voice rose, his anger boiling over. "What am I supposed to think, Claire? He's the father of our child, and you're acting like there's something more going on." Claire's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she said nothing. Then in a broken whisper, she confessed. "We kissed." Matt's world shattered in that instant. He felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. His best friend, the man he had trusted more than anyone in the world, had betrayed him, and Claire, his wife, had let it happen. "How could you?" Matt's voice cracked, his hands shaking with rage and disbelief. "How could you do this to me?" "It was a mistake," Claire sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Matt. I never meant for it to happen, but it did." "It was one moment, and I regretted it the second it happened." But her words did nothing to quell the fury burning inside Matt. All he could see was the betrayal, the violation of the bond he thought was unbreakable. He stormed out of the house, his mind spinning, unsure of what to do, unsure of anything anymore. Matt didn't go home that night. He spent hours driving aimlessly, trying to make sense of the chaos that had become his life. Eventually, he ended up at Jacob's apartment. When Jacob opened the door, the look on Matt's face said everything. "You kissed my wife," Matt said, his voice low and dangerous. Jacob's heart sank. "Matt, I can explain." "I don't want your explanation," Matt snapped. "I trusted you, Jake. I asked you to help us, to be part of something sacred, and you betrayed me. I didn't mean for it to happen, Matt, I swear. It was a mistake, a stupid, horrible mistake." Matt's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body trembling with barely contained rage. "Do you have feelings for her?" Matt asked, his voice sharp. Jacob hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that moment Matt knew the truth. "That's it, isn't it?" Matt said, his voice breaking. "You're in love with her." Jacob's silence was all the confirmation Matt needed. "Stay away from us," Matt growled, his voice cold. "Stay away from my wife. Stay away from my child." The birth of the baby should have been a joyous occasion, but instead, it was marked by a suffocating tension that hung over everything. Matt was there when Claire gave birth, but the joy that should have filled the room was tainted by the unspoken wounds that had yet to heal. Jacob didn't come to the hospital. He stayed away, just as Matt had ordered, and as the days passed, the distance between him and the life he had once been a part of grew wider and wider. Matt couldn't bring himself to look at the baby the same way. Every time he held his child, he was reminded of Jacob's betrayal, reminded that the baby wasn't truly his, but the product of a broken trust. Claire tried to repair the damage, but it was too late. The kiss, the confession, Jacob's unspoken love, it had all been too much. The friendship that had once been the cornerstone of their lives was shattered beyond repair.